on Bad Faith podcast for a second time is John Washington. He's a staff writer at Arizona Luminaria, a community-focused media outlet out there where you write about border politics. He's also the author of The Case for Open Borders, which I was so happy to talk to you about last time you were on the show. John, this time around, I want to talk to you about how immigration narratives have become a focus in the wake of Kamala Harris's general election loss and the sort of punching bag of some liberals who accuse the Harris campaign of being too far to the left on myriad issues, including the border crisis. I want to give the floor to you and first just ask what you make of some of the post-election prognostications.
Well, there's so much to try to keep in mind as we're in the transition period and about to enter into Trump 2.0. I think it really is essential to try to understand a little bit about where we got there, how we got here. There's a lot of analysis that could be done, but laying out some of the basic facts, I think, lays bare a little bit about, I would say, like the spinelessness of especially the American left in terms of border and immigration. And so one thing is just comparing where we started with the Biden-Harris campaign and where we ended up in, especially the last months while Kamala became the candidate running up into the election. So in early 2021, as Biden took office, there was a number of things that were on the agenda in terms of border and immigration politics. One of them was there's a couple of executive orders that were issued very early on. One of them was a 100-day moratorium on deportations. Another one was a pledge that was, relayed in various ways, including on the campaign, and then also early in office to restore asylum, to ramp up the refugee program, and to reprioritize what people were going to be targeted by ICE. He also promised on the campaign trail this is Biden, to end Title 42, which was the public health authority that the Trump administration used to basically deny almost all asylum claims.
So kind of a COVID era hook, like to stop asylum claims.
Exactly. That was, Stephen Miller's brainchild. He had been looking for years for a way to use Title 42. He actually floated it earlier on before anyone had heard of COVID, when there was a measles outbreak in a couple of immigration detention centers. And he said that we should suspend all entry into the United States from the southern border due to that. And that didn't fly. I mean, it was ridiculous. It was also ridiculous as a COVID policy because it didn't stop COVID. In fact, their border and immigration policies under the Trump administration spread COVID. And there's lots of evidence for how ICE detention centers became hotbeds and vectors, how we spread it to other countries, including Haiti and Guatemala, with far less equipped health programs. And so anyways, Title 42, that's what it was. Biden said he was going to end it, and it took him a few years. He sort of tried early on in the administration, but was blocked by the courts. Anyway, so that's where we started with Biden. Moratorium on deportations, restoring asylum. And where we end up is I got an email this afternoon celebrating the fact that ICE this fiscal year, has deported more people to more countries than ever before. They have repeatedly championed the use in recent months, championed the use of private detention companies to hold more immigrants. The number of people held in ICE detention has ramped up enormously. It was low because of COVID numbers when they came into office. It was around 15,000, which was far lower than the high point during the Trump administration. That's now funded up to 42,000. That was above what it was during the Obama administration. And, the whole campaign that Kamala Harris ran in terms of immigration was about cracking down. It was about trying to limit asylum. It was about working with very hard right restrictionists in the Republican Party to clamp down on the border, to promote this really sort of nonsensical idea of border security. And I think trying to understand that shift from where the administration began to where it ended up and where it is right now is actually really important. Why did the Democratic Party cave on all of these GOP demands? Why did they use the Trump playbook in order to, gain political credibility, supposedly, or gain this political capital so they could potentially pass a bill, which the bill that they were championing was, I mean, really actually to the right of some of the first legislative proposals that were submitted in the first Trump administration. So, I think that is a huge part of how actually Trump won again. I mean, one of the main driving narratives of the Trump campaign was that he would crack down on the border. And when you compare what Trump was saying, there was a different tone, but in practice and, in actual policy means it wasn't really that different from what the Kamala Harris campaign was promoting. And I covered a lot of rallies in Southern Arizona. I talked to a lot of voters leading up to the election, and the first thing out of almost everyone's mouth was about the border. And I think again, the fact that the left caved, at least on the narrative, and also I would say legislatively, is that they really let the Republicans drive the way that we understand border and immigration policies. And this has been a problem for a couple decades at this point.
So talk to me about what you were hearing from voters, because I think what some listeners might be wondering is, okay, this guy is saying that this is a voter concern, that people are bringing up to him that they are motivated politically by concerns, fears, anxieties about increased border crossings, crime, however it is that they frame it. And I do want you to tell me more specifically what they were saying. But also, the Democrats were wrong to move to the right and adopt conservative narrative framing around those issues in response to polls which showed that voters had higher trust in Republicans on the issue of immigration and the border crisis. So for people who might be struggling to kind of reconcile those two thoughts, what would you say?
There's a number of ways to answer. One is, I think it's worth remembering exactly what the polls say. So there are recent polls that show that despite the central idea of the Trump administration to conduct mass deportations, still the majority of Americans favor a pathway towards citizenship than mass deportations. There's very recent polling right before the election that was still showing that. But the problem is, the path to citizenship wasn't really on the agenda of either party, truly. I think to me, it seems more like the narrative was coming out of the spokespeople of the campaigns, and that a lot of the voters were adopting, or one might more pejoratively say like parroting, rather than going the other direction. And it's like the people in the campaign were actually listening to the voters. And the reason I say that is because, like I said, I talked to a lot of people, and while the border and immigration policies were often forefront of their mind, when I would talk to them about it, it's like, well, what is it exactly you want, or how have you been affected by border policies? And I live in what is, more or less a border town. It's 50 miles north of the border, is the first major stop after you're crossing over from Mexico into Arizona, or this part of Arizona. And no one really was affected by it, because it really is like, just business as usual in Southern Arizona. We've always had people passing through. We have a diverse community of people who, some from northern Mexico, some from different Mexico, but this has always been the case, and that's still the case. And actually, crime overall is down in Tucson, and yet people would say, "I'm scared to go out of my house because of migrants." I'm like, "Did something happen to you? Have you seen something?" It's like, "No." then okay, well then what is it that scares you? She's like, oh, it's just totally out of control. And she's like, I am down at the border. I see people trying to cross and submit themselves into Border Patrol's custody so they can ask for asylum. You don't see people like running amok, running with weapons. I mean, that's just not the actual situation here on the border. One person, a number of people said something similar to me that they were like literally physically scared. One person, when I was like, "Well, has it affected you personally?" They said they thought about it, and I appreciate this answer, and I think about it a lot. Said, "Well, it's affected my attitude." It's like,
Hmm.
yeah, but it hasn't affected you physically. It hasn't affected you economically. It hasn't affected your job prospects or your job security. It hasn't driven up uh, prices of housing or food or any of these things. And the fact that that is a concern of most people, I think shows that the border is used as sort of a scapegoat for all of those other very real issues. Those issues are affecting people. And what is the solution to them? It's actually much more complicated. It involves international trade, tariffs, taxes, like all these things that are a little bit more complicated to talk about. And yet, politicians and campaigners often just thrust all of them into this very tidy package of if we fix the border, we're going to solve all of your woes, when there's just actually not evidence for that.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the other punching bag issue that emerged in the wake of Kamala's loss, which was a number of people who are saying that the Democratic Party was too woke. And by that, they mostly are talking about translated issues. And similarly, that is an issue area where it seems quite obvious that an almost zero number of people are directly affected by any of these policies. Certainly, almost zero number of non-trans people are affected by any of these policies, and yet it is affecting people's ideas. What did the person you spoke to say? That they're affecting it changed their
affected my
notions,
attitude. Yeah.
their attitude.
Yeah. Yeah.
That being said, we're also in the middle of this discourse about in which so many sort of establishment liberals are making the case that economic arguments as to that are attempting to explain what happened in the election are also wrong because of these kind of macroeconomic trends being positive. The people, why don't they understand the economy is good actually? And it could not be economic anxiety that was driving any of these trends. And I know that you're not saying that, you're saying quite the opposite, that the underlying economic precarity, discomfort, anxiety is real, and that border policies are being used as a scapegoat and immigrants are being used as a scapegoat for these feelings. But I just want to make sure to disentangle that, because there is a way that we can sound like we're saying, no, the people are wrong when they say they are feeling some kind of way about something. But as I'm considering the messaging that Democrats could have taken up, it's not that I don't think it's necessarily complicated or more complicated to say, I have an alternate explanation for why you're suffering. From my perspective, it seems like the Democratic Party quite simply didn't want to support the policies that would have helped to alleviate that suffering. And so it's frankly easier just to try to out conservatives on immigration instead of offering an alternative explanation for why people are feeling economic hardship, even if it's not directly tied to immigration. One other piece that I do feel compelled to ask you about is the relationship between immigration and the effect on basically the lower tranche of American workers. I do think that sometimes there's a credibility issue that happens when there's a attempt to deny that there's any impact on particularly low-wage workers from immigration. I know there's a somewhat controversial, I suppose, in the immigration space, you tell me, Borjas study that talks about exactly this. And people don't want to overstate it. To your point, so many people that you talk to are not themselves economically impacted, but that doesn't mean somebody else isn't. Particularly, and we saw this kind of bear out in poll numbers, people who themselves were immigrants or are recent immigrants who sometimes occupy that lower tranche of American workers do feel that find themselves in direct competition in ways that might be motivating numbers of Latino voters to increasingly identify with Trump or with conservatives. And so I did want to ask you to sort of tease some of that apart, you know, and respond to this idea that the left is denying real world economic experiences that are negative as a consequence of immigration, and how to address those while not abandoning one's sort of moral and ethical social justice commitments to immigrants themselves.
Yeah, so I would say you're right, and yet I think there is a really important caveat here. Is if you had a lot more migration the way that we have it set up right now, some of like the lower tranche of some American workers, and I actually when you really look at it, and economists have done this, who potentially could be under threat in terms of wages and employment, is a very, very narrow segment of the population. Um, and they could be threatened because employers could give lower wages, especially to undocumented people. But if those people were documented, if that was not the black market or the gray market, they couldn't pay them much lower rates. So there would be that same sort of competition that there is right now. So I think that is one factor that cannot be overlooked when you're trying to assess who is impacted. They're impacted because there's an incentive to drive wages down because of this class stratification that we have across borders or across who is documented and who is not. That has to be part of the conversation. But yes, I appreciate your point. We also really need to take a really realistic and hard look at this and say, okay, yeah, the way that we have things set up right now, maybe there would be some potential negative impact on people. But is that not resolvable? Like, could we not potentially have more robust minimum wage standards? Could we not have more robust economy through different forms of taxation? And I think when you're not putting those sorts of ideas on the table to talk about, you're really just trying to like narrow the conversation into a way that like it makes it seem impossible to find a solution. There's a Thomas Piketty quote that I'm going to partially butcher, but I also think about quite a bit in terms of this. It's something like when there is no credible alternative to the socioeconomic or like class stratification system that we have right now, when nothing is proffered as a solution or alternative to that, of course people are going to go towards pushing back on anything that they think threatens their identity, or pushing back on anyone who's coming in from supposedly an outside as an outsider. And so this is sort of like why I think people who move across international boundaries are so easily scapegoated. There's this indigestion at home that is being outsourced supposedly as like a problem coming from outside.
Can you actually, I think that's a really good point and a reason to drill down on asylum and also on the backlog, not just in the asylum context, but for people trying to legally pursue immigration status in the United States of America. Because I did recently read some reporting on opinions among Latino voters, and this attitude keeps coming up that people I know in my family have been waiting a very long time. I don't want any new immigrants to jump the line. And that seems to have been driving some of the shift right among Latino communities that was unanticipated by Democrats, who I guess presumed that one immigrant community is going to see themselves as having a mirrored interest in a newer immigrant community, and not see themselves as having necessary trade-offs in these ways, or having resentments about how hard it was for them or somebody that they knew versus someone who they perceived to be benefiting from some Biden era largesse which didn't really exist, but which is really being hyped up by a conservative media apparatus that's talking about sanctuary cities and free checks for this kind of immigrant and that kind of immigrant and all these kinds of things. So as I'm witnessing these conversations, it seems to me that there's a lot of conflation between um, asylees and, I guess, how would you describe a more generic sort of person who isn't trying to say that the place that they came from is inhospitable under our asylum laws, and so they deserve a right to stay, versus someone who's kind of more economically driven and openly economically driven. So can you untangle those things, and maybe then separately, and I can come back to it if you forget, speak to why it is that there's so much frustration about the current status quo in the immigration system?
I think, yeah, those are two very related questions, and let me try to tackle them both. I have lots of experience, including direct family experience of migrants trying to pull up the ladder after they, get over the wall. That is the story of my family. I'm not proud to say it, but my family comes from Romania, and a lot of them, like, direct and extended family members, now are immigration restrictionists. And I think the idea that people should either do it the right way or get in line or they're jumping the line, and I'm going to kind of pull the same move I pulled on the last question, I think it is looking at the idea too narrowly. It's like, yeah, in some sense that may be true, is that people are trying to work the system because this is the only, at this point, really opportunity or way that anyone can get towards safety or towards any sense of political or economic stability for a lot of the people who are on the move. And so I think if you only look at what happens when they either cross the border or arrive into some, like, maybe ultimate destination in the United States, you're missing the system that is set up throughout the world. Is like the refugee resettlement program, especially in the United States, has been in decline. Biden, increased it a little bit, or a fair amount, but there's, the number of people who are resettled through the refugee program, which is when someone doesn't have to make it to another country. They can actually apply from home, is not nearly robust enough to actually deal with the amount of claims there are. And a number of other countries throughout the world, per capita and in gross numbers, are receiving far, far, far more refugees than the United States. So that's really not an avenue. There's a couple tiny little pilot programs where people can apply for some sort of relief through the asylum system from a different country. That, the number of people able to use that is in the dozens, literally. And so when Mexico is, at the behest of the United States, cracking down on people who are transiting north, trying to find safety or opportunity, when the visa lottery system is so overwhelmed with numbers, when the backlog in processing visas for family reunification takes years or decades in some cases, like, what do people do? Honestly, like, where do they live? If they can't live at home, they have no sense of safety or security, they have no future because of complete impoverishment. What do they do? And so we can say, go get in a line somewhere, but if a line doesn't exist, we're relegating them to, you know, uh, absolute precarity and to in many cases also death. So yeah, that might be the case, that people are not doing it in the same way, same orderly way that people did it in decades past, but that is because we have limited their options to such a degree that it is life or death. Make this, and this is not something that is abstract. I'm talking about, and I'll give you a couple examples here because I think too often we talk abstractly about this. I was down reporting in northern Mexico not very long ago, and I'll tell two brief stories, and they're both pretty intense, but I think it's important to understand the urgency that people feel. One woman and her teenage son, they were living in the central Mexican state of Guerrero. They fled after her husband was beheaded and his his head was put in an ice box on her front stoop. Um,
Oh my God,
yeah,
John.
yeah. She and her 14-year-old son left that same night. They didn't know how the asylum system worked in the United States. They took a series of buses. They made it to Nogales, which is the closest port of entry into the United States. And they showed up at the border saying, "We need protection." And the guards there were like, "No, no, no, no. That's not how this works." And I don't even know if someone actually explained it to them at that moment, but the way that it works now is she has to go back into Mexico, download a phone application called CBP1, try to set up an appointment. The standard or like the average length that it takes to get an appointment right now is between 3 and 9 months. Wait in the same country where she is being chased by people who just tortured and murdered her husband. I mean, she showed me a video of her husband being hung by the hands by a tree. It was basically a snuff video. And that is why she fled. Another family I spoke with, um, similar sort of setup situation. They lived in a pretty remote part of Michoacan in the state of Michoacan in Mexico, and the uh, woman was 19, the man was 22. They had a 2-year-old daughter and infant triplets. The woman didn't know that she was pregnant with triplets until they came out. She went to the doctor once in her first trimester, and she had no idea that she had triplets. She thought it was like a really big baby. Um, because of her husband, his age, they were trying to recruit him into a gang. He refused. They started threatening him, his wife, and then the triplets, and that was the last straw. And they said, "We're out. We're gone. We can't stay here any longer." They actually crossed the border. They paid a human smuggler, a coyote, to cross the border, and they submitted themselves willingly into the hands of Border Patrol. And they said, "We're here to ask for asylum." They were told that they couldn't, though, there, and that is because of Biden administration policies that were put in place this June, and they were sort of extended in September, that really severely limits who can apply for asylum. Border guard.
What are those policies? What is that policy?
So the policy basically is that anyone who crosses not through a port of entry is basically automatically denied asylum and is sent back with at least a 5-year ban. Often it's a 10-year ban from ever entering the country or from entering the country within that period again. The problem is, as I say, like as I just mentioned with the other stories, that trying to get in through a port of entry takes many months, and especially if you're fleeing someone in Mexico or even the Mexican government in some cases, staying in Mexico is not a safe thing to do. So this family with a 2-year-old daughter and triplets, so 4 kids in tow, crossed. They were told that there was no asylum, basically. They were sent back into Nogales, and all of them, including the triplets, infant triplets, were given a 5-year ban from entering the United States again. So this is the situation where these people, if they could, the family with the triplets are not going to try again. They told me they're not going to try again to cross and skirt authorities instead of submit themselves to authorities, because the triplets, I mean, God, I can't imagine. But other people, after they, are denied summarily like that, say, "I'm not safe here. I can't wait 6-9 months. So I will try." And so this is the kind of people often who are coming in who are skipping the line. Well, what do we expect of them? Like, put yourself in that situation, in their shoes, and do you think they should go try to make it back where they just fled? Like, I mean, for a lot of people, that is truly not an option.
This idea of there being these enormously long wait times, that the line is really, really long, is a recurring impediment, it seems, in these conversations. So can you speak to what would be required to create the staffing or funding to make those lines move more quickly? It feels as though we talk about this as though it's an inevitability that this just takes time. These processes take time. But can you hire more administrative law judges? Can you hire more processing staff of whatever type to make it so that the system works more efficiently? And has it worked more efficiently in the past?
I would say that it has worked more efficiently in the past, in some part because there were less people who were forced to, and I think that's important, or given no other option but trying to apply for asylum. So that has really led to the bottleneck that we're in right now. Yeah, and there have been bills proposed that would really ramp up the number of asylum officers. Right now, there's a core of a couple thousand asylum officers, ramp up the number of immigration judges. But those bills are not the sexy bills that are promising more miles of wall or more surveillance technology or more border guards. And the latter are the ones that are actually getting either passed or getting more seriously debated and, nearly passed as the most recent bill that Kamala Harris was repeatedly championing on the campaign trail. There was a little bit of money going towards hiring more asylum officers, but overwhelmingly it was outweighed by the crackdown at the border, and it wasn't really doing anything to developing a serious pathway to citizenship in which you get people out of the legal limbo. I think that's another really important sort of legacy of the Biden administration to remember is that there are millions of people that are in what is called twilight status. That is where they have some safety from being deported right now, but they have no actual legal, no really accessible legal pathway towards permanent status, and their protected status will expire. It will expire within the next 4 years for many people. And a number, like one particular segment of the population who doesn't really get talked about, but there are a lot of people, young people in the country who get what's called derivative status from their parents. And as soon as they turn 21, they age out of that status. So they will need to re-up somehow their protected status. And under a Trump administration, that is probably not going to happen. So we're letting all of these people lapse into what will become undocumented. And this is something that could have been addressed, but there wasn't either the political will or maybe possibility really in the last 4 years. I mean, that's debatable, but it didn't happen at least.
Uh, the elephant in the room is that we are heading into a Trump administration, and Donald Trump just recently reaffirmed his commitment not just to mass deportations, but to using the military in service of these mass deportations. Can you speak to what your expectations are in the second Trump term?
Yeah.
And what, if anything, a sort of, not to use this now very loaded word, but resistance to that looks like?
I think there's so many different realms in which people need to be paying attention right now, and especially in terms of just in terms of immigration. The mass deportations, like what's that going to look like? The use of military or National Guard, like what's that going to look like? These are all like educated guesses at this point, but I think it's going to be intense, like those couple things. And yet, I think part of the problem again is that too many people on the left have been sort of not being part of this resistance, or have been sort of allowing sort of the framework or the runway for such mass deportation to take place. And a case in point here is again in Arizona, our Democratic governor Katie Hobbs just this week went down to the border to do a press conference, and she celebrated the fact that she has actually already placed National Guard along the border.
This work builds on the more than 170 service members embedded in law enforcement agencies across the state as part of the National Guard's counter-drug program. It expands our efforts to ports of entry and increases our statewide operational capacity by over 20%. These efforts are just part of a comprehensive multi-million-dollar strategic effort by my administration to crack down on drug trafficking, support law enforcement, and deliver treatment to Arizonans affected by the fentanyl crisis.
And so, when our Democratic governors are, in the weeks after the Trump victory, celebrating the fact that they've already sent military to the border, like, what do we expect? I mean, will they stymie in any way, this mass deportation campaign? She said she paid a little bit of lip service to that. She's like, we're not going to try to disrupt our communities. But that is also inevitably what is going to happen. In Arizona as well, the voters just passed Prop 314. There's about 4 or 5 bills in different states throughout the country right now that would grant authority to local law enforcement to police immigration violations and actually affect deportations. That would be a major, major shift from about 150 years, 140 some years of precedents where only the federal government has the authority to enforce immigration laws. So, this would probably take a Supreme Court decision, but, there's a, conservative majority right now that could grow in the next couple of years, and that could radically change the way that borders are enforced. A couple other things I think are really important to look out for is in terms of asylum. So the way that immigration courts work, this is a little wonky, but it's actually kind of important to understand, is they're not Article 3 courts. You're the attorney, I'm not, so I'm stretching a little bit here, but
Sure, I handled one pro bono immigration case though, so I'm going to defer to your expertise.
yeah. So immigration court is run by the Department of Justice. Immigration judges used to be prosecutors. They got the robes and they got sort of partially reclassified in the 1980s, but they very much still act like prosecutors in many cases. They can grill people who are in immigration court, and they also, and this is the important part, are subject to the Attorney General of the federal Attorney General. So what we saw, and we see like a little bit less, but we saw it in the Trump administration, where the Attorney General really used that sort of political weight to change the way that asylum laws were processed. And there's a couple of really important cases. One was the matter of AB that basically stripped people who were fleeing any sort of gender-based violence from being able to access asylum. That was Jeff Sessions and then his successor, Bill Barr, under the Trump administration, both like upheld that rescission of granting protections for gender-based violence. And then under the Biden administration, they were restored partially. But now what was going to happen? I mean, Matt Gaetz, is out, but now, Pam Bondi, what position is she going to take on that? And there's all sorts of ways that without passing any laws, either through executive order or through these sort of these decisions by the Attorney General, could really change the landscape of how asylum cases are heard. And the denial rate has increased under the Biden administration. It's gone from, I think, about 50. I've been switching denial and grant rate. Grant rate was about 50, and now grant rate is about 85%, or maybe mixing up my numbers a little bit there. But the grant rate has decreased dramatically just in the last 4 years, and expected to plummet as we come up to the early months of the Trump administration. The other part of your question was resistance. That
I mean,
yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, what does it look like? I mean, I think that we saw some wins, certainly in the Trump administration, or some partial wins, when in the first weeks of the first Trump administration, one of his signature early policies was this so-called Muslim ban, where, denying entrance into the United States to anyone from, all Muslim and North Korean countries, or a bunch of Muslim countries and North Korea. And people were enraged, and they went to the airports. There are mass protests, and the Supreme Court, partially blocked some of that during the family separation crisis. International outcry about what happened, and I think it did push the Trump administration to curtail, not completely end, family separation. So I think it's important to remember that actually mass mobilization has moved the needle in the past during the Trump administration, but, and this is what everyone's reporting and saying, is like they are much more efficient. They have developed these shields to block their policies from being undermined by, resistance in any way. And I think that probably is going to be the case. But I would say that it probably shouldn't be hopeless either.
Yeah, I mean, the Muslim ban getting blocked because Trump basically says, yes, it's a Muslim ban, and admits to it being a policy that's discriminatory on the basis of religion, as opposed to the arguably legal restrictions on these are various countries where there's hotbeds of terrorism or whatever what these arguments are. These like kind of Obama era lists where these countries come from is part of why the plan was foiled, right? Because he couldn't keep his big mouth shut. But they're learning, they're evolving, they've got better people this time around. And so I take your warning well, but it also does seem to me, I mean, I heed your warning, but it does also seem to me, I have this question as to whether or not there is going to be as much resistance, because you have had a Democratic leadership that has adopted this conservative framing and affirmed and confirmed it. Are we going to see people, kvetching about border separation policies and deportation when you have seen Democrats bragging about their deportation numbers and continuing so many Trump era border policies? At what point does that dissonance become so uncomfortable that Democrats pretend not to care? Your Katie Britt example, for instance, if you are bragging about your willingness to send the National Guard to the border, and if you're Hillary Clinton bragging about how much border wall you built, or Kamala Harris bragging about how much wall you built, then aren't you neutered in your ability to make these criticisms, these kind of 2016 era criticisms of Donald Trump when he returns to office? To that end, I am curious, have you given thought to what kind of messaging you would have liked to see from Democrats that you think could have shifted the needle in terms of these polls that show the American voters do trust conservatives more with border issues? Do you think there's a progressive humanistic messaging that addresses the fundamental concerns about economic precarity and violence that people feel, even if it's just their attitude, that would have worked without throwing immigrants under the bus?
This is something that I address at length in my book. And I think that, I can't purport to really give like political strategy to the Democrats, but I think what I would do is I'd say that people on the left, or people who believe in justice or human rights, could stand on principle when it comes to the immigration policy. And I think that even politicians could state the principle that they believe in, and then also, acknowledge that they have to play politics and there's always some form of compromise involved. So what is a principle, I think, that respects justice and human rights in terms of immigration and border policies is that I think everyone, regardless of where they were born, deserves basic human dignity. I think that is something that is actually often overlooked in terms of immigration policy, is that we actually are willing to prosecute and criminalize people who help people in need. This is something that comes up along borderlines throughout the world all the time, is people are suffering, they're cold, they're hot, they're hungry, they're in bad shape, they're sick, and they're migrating. They're in the process of migrating. And, in Southern Arizona, if I were to put someone in the car and try to give them help, I could be arrested and convicted of harboring. I personally don't think that's okay. I think that, we have, as, a civilization or greater society, I think we have taken pretty big strides. We still have a long way to go. We have taken pretty big strides in trying to eliminate prejudice based on race, religion, sexuality, gender. But one thing that's been left off the table over the last 100 years and really hasn't gained any traction is discriminating against someone based on where they were born. That too is an immutable characteristic. You can't do anything about that. And you have less rights. You have basically zero due process if you come here and you weren't born here. You know, I think that acknowledging that, saying that that is not okay, saying that we believe and respect human rights and human dignity, I think is a good starting point, a good principle to stand on. And then you can say, yeah, okay, now we have to figure this out, and we can play politics now. But people haven't been saying that. People have just been acquiescing or caving to kick them out. They're criminals. This is the dominant narrative in many regards, that they are a threat, whether it's economic or in terms of security. That is how more and more people look at folks who are from abroad. And I think, this is what xenophobia is. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous for migrants. It's dangerous for people of color. We have seen incredible violence enacted upon, synagogues, the Walmart shooting that was, targeting Latinos. Like this is not a hypothetical. This is something that we have seen, and I think being clear about that is a good starting place.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm thinking of, how much of a shift came after Bernie Sanders started talking about all kinds of things as in human rights framework, and that I really do believe in the rhetorical power of kind of values-centered arguments. And I do wonder what would have happened if Democrats had kept any of their sort of moral umbrage from 2016 and carried it through these next few years, instead of completely having no scruples, no confidence in the moral position whatsoever, being completely led by polls. Democrats fundamentally seem to not believe in persuasion. They are poll-tested cretins who will race to the bottom at every opportunity.
Well put.
And that being said, it does feel like, if we kind of agree with this principle that like precarity drives people to want to blame others and to pull up the ladder and retrench themselves, thinking about precarity on sort of a global scale with full knowledge of how lucky we are in the United States and how bad things are at other places, it feels like an even more significant hurdle to convince people that our destiny as a species is shared, when we're talking about us versus somebody from Guatemala, or us versus somebody from Sudan, or us versus someone, from inter part of the world, than even trying to convince an American that they should like care about an American who's Black or brown or whatever, and support a universal policy, even though it's going to help some undeserving poor person. I mean, it just seems like an exponentially tougher argument to make. And I'm not really going anywhere with this other than it's a little bit overwhelming, especially in the context of the climate crisis, where I think constantly about a potential future scenario where we're begging Canadians to give us a little bit of grace as they sit on some of the world's largest freshwater supplies and obviously a cooler climate and a ton of space, and how the tables might turn. But how do you convince someone who was born on third base that they should share it? We like to get them to understand that they're, but for the grace of God, when we have so many Americans, so many of us have such limited exposure to the rest of the world and don't even fully appreciate how lucky we are, and how we would want to be treated if the shoe were on the other foot. And also because there is real precarity, right? Like things are getting worse for Americans.
Yeah.
And it seems like if there's no off ramp for that, if it's going to be a continual backslide into God knows what for any number of reasons, it does seem like it's going to make people to want to hold on even tighter.
Mm-hmm. I think that's, a really smart question to pose, all of us. And I think that there needs to be a lot of work done to really tackle it. A couple of things that I think it actually is in our shared interest. and are as in like the people who are born on third base is I'll use that we right now, to seriously address things like climate change, to seriously address the upheaval of the global population. And I think that one way that I maybe see as sort of a reframe is like, what would be your end goal actually if you're just going to like sort of hunker back and dig in on your restrictionist attitude? Like, so let's say that climate change is coming, more and more people are going to be forced to move. Do you think that like walling them off and just like letting them be immobilized in a place that is effectively unlivable is in your interest? Because that doesn't really work, actually. We don't have any evidence of successfully blocking huge portions of the population that are forced to flee. Like that doesn't happen. So you're going to either put them into a isolated area for a while, like a slum, or like along some of the world's border walls, and eventually that is going to become a powder keg and is going to blow over or blow up, and is going to then lead to a more volatile and less orderly form of migration, and or like trying to like retrench back into nationalism. I mean, this is how we saw the world wars in the 20th century take off. This isn't actually in our interest either. We know now that like the market has shown us that we are a global community, or maybe not the healthiest one, but so we are, and like trying to pretend that we can like actually only trade in goods and riches and not have the same freedom of movement of people just isn't going to work, and it's not going to be good for people on either side of the border. And you very rightly point out that that the other shoe is going to drop, and it already is. I mean, a lot of Americans are having to flee or move, call it what you want, because of climate change. There's, hundreds of billions of dollars in disaster funds that are being doled out to try to, stave off the worst excesses of climate disasters, and it's going to increase. So, you have to think of it in terms of a more global community. Otherwise, you yourself are going to be suffering as well.
From your perspective, is anybody talking about this stuff in the right way? Are there any bright spots politically for folks who you think are sort of getting this messaging right?
Wow. That's an interesting question. I think I could probably single out a couple people, but I think overall, I've just been disappointed. I really have been in the embrace of in the capitulation of the left generally. I think that one sort of related point here is that even folks, sorry, my the light is shifting a lot. We hit sunset time here, and the sun just dropped, and I'm going into the darkness. I'm gonna flip on the light here. I think I think maybe more restrictionists are sort of the ones who also understand the implications of their policies, and this is why they're actually talking out of both sides of their mouth at the same time. It's like people say that they don't want more migrants to come to the United States, but they desperately need them. And if they're in the business community or if they work like politically with the business community, they know that it would be devastating for actually sealing the border. I mean, there's been some good reporting on this. Jack Herrera, I think, does great work for a couple different outlets about focusing mostly on Texas and the construction industry. I mean, the construction industry is disproportionately made up of recent migrants, including a lot of undocumented people. And there is an enormous vacancy in the construction. There's like 1 million jobs need to be filled. And Americans just aren't picking up the hammers to do it. And so if you were to block anyone from coming in, if you were able to deport the people who are in the construction industry, there's numbers like, I think it's over 40% or around 40% of drywallers in the United States are undocumented. Just like, drywall's kind of ugly, but you kind of need it, I guess, in modern building. And like, what are you going to put on your walls if you don't have folks to do it? And, I think that they can say we want more restrictions, but if the Trump administration is actually able to invoke the Alien Enemies Act, is able to somehow garner up the funds and get more planes and build tent cities for immigrants, we would see the impacts. And I think then is when, going back to your previous question, I think that is when you might start to see the mobilization. It's got to hurt first, because right now, in terms of principle, I don't think we're there. In terms of politics, we're certainly not. We've caved. The left has caved. But when you start seeing your neighbors being taken away, when your local eatery is raided, when people aren't showing up for work because they're in encampments, that might be when more resistance happens.
Ugh. You have to hurt to understand are lyrics from a Carly Simon song I really love, but not the kind of message I want. We're talking about immigration instead of, romance. It's a little dark, John. And this is a little bit more of another one of these sort of esoteric conversations about immigration than I had initially planned. I mean, there's so much going on and everyone's worried about what is tangibly going to look like. But when I find myself sitting in front of you, it's so infrequent that I feel like there's space for a more moral kind of conversation, if that's the right word for it, or one that kind of reflects my value of not thinking borders are ethical. But as a leftist, I mean, so often we're accused of, especially like a PMC leftist, not contending with the economic realities of working people. I mean, that's definitionally what we're talking about. We're talking about PMC leftists. And I do think that there is a dismissiveness sometimes in like bourgeois conversations about immigration that dismisses all concerns as boiling down to racism. And so I feel very torn. And I do feel when I talk to you, like free to kind of explore some of my own ambivalence. And I know that it creates a sort of a vague and meandering conversation, but I appreciate your patience with me as I work through how I feel about some of this and try to contend with what the next few years are going to look like. So thank you, John, for your patience. And can you remind the audience where they can find your book and anything else that you're writing or doing on the internet and beyond?
Yeah, and I appreciate that candidness. And I think that these sort of more winding moral principle conversations are really important to have. I think that's what you really lean on when you get into politics, or at least what you should lean on when you get into politics or talk politics. And yeah, I think just remembering where you stand as a person, like what your either political moral philosophy is, and then also remembering the actual impacts, and like that it's not just a game of political football, but like those people that we talked about that I was able to share some of their stories, like those people are affected by how we talk about it and what policies we enact. And remembering that, I think, is just is critical, and yet we've not been thinking about them enough. So thank you, and I appreciate the winding conversation myself. You can find me. So I'm a reporter for Arizona Luminaria. We cover Southern Arizona, the border, and lots more. I have a Substack. You can find me there, and Twitter, Blue Sky, all that good stuff. And my latest book is The Case for Open Borders from Haymarket.
Terrific. John Washington, thank you so much. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Bad Faith Podcast. You can get an additional episode every week on Mondays at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Appreciate your support over there. And to everyone, take care of yourselves, keep the faith, and happy Thanksgiving. All right, take care. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.